Here is the beauty and the poetry and the dreaming that was floating around for people in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that made it feel like worshipping the moon was something that already moved them because it was in their culture. Worshipping Pan was something that you would do anyway because it's already in the literary and the visual culture. And then there's all the anthropology floating around saying, well, the earliest witchcraft, the earliest religion of all human beings is what we call witchcraft, and it's magical, and it worshipped the prime maternal force.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. Today we welcome Christina Oakley-Harrington. Christina is Treadwell's founder and presiding spirit. She was voraciously interested in spirituality and magic since childhood and grew up in West Africa, Burma, and Chile, only moving to the West at the age of 15. In her 20s, she was heartened to discover Europe's own native religious traditions and has been a pagan ever since. A former academic, she left university life in 2001 to establish Treadwell's. These days, she serves as a consultant for programs and projects, but is usually at the shop. She is the author of 2 books and numerous articles and was co-founder and literary editor of Abraxas, International Journal for Esoteric Studies. Today, we discuss her new book from Black Letter Press, Dreams of Witches. Free, pagan, transgressive worshippers of Pan, devotees of Diana, the men and women who meet under the full moon in the wild woods, danced, sang, made music, and made love. In the home, they make potions and mutter spells, be it to cure or curse. The witch image infused the European imagination down through the centuries, appearing in court records, prose, and poetry. The impulse the literature described finally became a practiced mystery religion in the 20th century, in the form of Wicca as it coalesced in the New Forest in the 1930s and 40s. The poems and passages in the book illustrate the supportive imagination of the New Forest Coven and its most famous initiate, Gerald Gardner. They date from the late medieval period through to the Edwardian age, and all were influential in inspiring early pagans, and hopefully too, readers today. It's a fantastic conversation, and Christina is incredibly knowledgeable and shares that knowledge with us today. And I think it's something that you're going to enjoy. In the Plus show, we get into cunning folk, we discuss the Coven's importance around doing no harm and acting with integrity, and Christina describes the body as a source of magical energy, and more broadly, the adoption of magic and as part of one's agency. Christina then really switches the mic and interviews me about some of my previous adventures behind the camera. Now, if this is something that sounds of interest to you, it's very easy for you to access that. Simply click the Patreon link below and come and join the fam. Come and join the fam. Okay, that's it from me. Let's get on with the show. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome back to the Spirit Box the lovely and wonderful and talented Christina Oakley-Harrington. It's very lovely to have you back on the show. There's a lot of lovelies in there. So there you go.
Dara, it's grand to be here.
So you've recently published a book, a real thing of beauty, the Dreams of Witches with Black Letter Press. And it was a couple of weeks ago. You just happened to bump into you in Treadwell's.
Yeah, we ran into you at Treadwell's, and lo and behold, we had a chat about it, and we decided to get together and talk about witchcraft and dreams and the imagination.
So to help kind of orientate people, could you tell them a little bit about it yourself if people aren't aware of your work?
Great. If you don't know me, I'm Christina Oakley-Harrington. I am probably best known for being the founder of Treadwell's Bookshop in central London. Before that, I was an academic. I was a medieval historian, and one of the great things that I, enjoy, having had a trained scholarly background, but actually not having to publish or perish, is that I can research in my own time things that I really love and care about. And Dreams of Witches was a book published by Black Letter Press a few months ago, and it's about the amazing cultural and literary and imaginative culture that brewed up the modern pagan witchcraft revival in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
And it really is. It's a lovely anthology, and I think the title just sums up the content so well. There's a real kind of like, well, this sounds so clumsy. Real dreamlike quality to everything you've pulled together. Oh my god, I don't even know if I'm going to have to leave that in. We'll see. We'll see if that makes it to
We'll
the
see.
end.
We'll
Like,
see.
so cringe and corny. My apologies, but
Yeah.
it's lovely what you've done. And it really helps just kind of show how these kind of nascent seeds and ideas were kind of re-emerging, from the darkness for so long, and brought together by this kind of special group of people.
One of the things that I brought together when Claudio Rocchetti from Black Letter Press contacted me and he said, Christina, would you do a book for Black Letter Press? That's an enormous, enormous honor because it's a press that it's an honor to be approached by. And the second thing was it gave me an opportunity to rifle through 40 years of poetry reading for me and to, find all of the little tabs in all of my books of poetry and all the mad books on witchcraft and anthropology from the Edwardian and Victorian period, which I had marked, on my pencil, marginalia, exclamation, yes, witches, yes, the moon, yes, moon worship, oh yes, poem. And so I spent in lockdown a couple months revisiting all of my bookshelves and the internet and taking the little the post-it notes and the marginal notes and retyping them and saying here's here is the beauty and the poetry and the dreaming that was floating around for people in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that made it feel like worshipping the moon was something that already moved them because it was in their culture. Worshipping Pan was something that you would do anyway because it's already in the literary and the visual culture. And then there's all the anthropology floating around saying, well, the earliest witchcraft, the earliest religion of all human beings is what we call witchcraft, and it's magical, and it worshipped the prime maternal force. Now, this may be a history of religion and history of ethnography and anthropology that we don't agree with now. But if you're an Edwardian, that's what you're reading about in the newspaper. That's what's in the bookshops. That's what people are talking about at the British Museum at the nice lectures you go along to. And it seems such a short step to say we can do this again. It's not a big step. It's not a big step to say, well, surely that sounds like a lot of fun. That sounds really beautiful. That sounds really moving. That sounds like a kind of religiosity that we want to have rather than being forced to sit in a cold parish church and told that we're sinners every Sunday. The 20s, of course, were the time, the suffragette movement. So at the same time that they're hearing the primal religion was a worship of the Great Mother, they're also surrounded by people saying, well, isn't it outrageous that half the population, the women, cannot vote? They cannot have a bank account. They have to, on marriage, they lose the ability to even, buy anything that costs more than groceries for their home without the husband's signature. The enslavery of women of a economic sort is in their faces at the same time that they're reading about and learning about and assume to be true a past in which women had agency and autonomy and that there was joy rather than shame around the body. So of course they wanted to do it. Of course they wanted to do it. Who wouldn't? They're also discovering that the caves at Lascaux, the Paleolithic caves, where there's really primal energies. And so they're starting to see abstract art for the first time and an appreciation of Paleolithic art for the first time in England. And so the ancients don't seem so oogity boogity, the ancients seem really quite sorted and the primal seems quite beautiful, perhaps for the very first time.
And one of the the, the major kind of thinkers in that area that you pull up in the book again around the same time is Margaret Murray
Mm-hmm.
and her work. And it's one of those ones where
when you talk about kind of the challenges of the time, I mean, Margaret Murray came in for a lot of criticism and critique about her ideas and her thesis, um, which you can only imagine kind of the level of kind of misogyny behind that at the time. You know,
Mm.
quite a brave piece of work that she pulled together. Um, and I kind of wanted to ask your thoughts on that particular body of work.
Mhm.
Um, do you think that we're going to see in time kind of Margaret Murray kind of given um, credit that she didn't get at the time?
For those who aren't familiar with it, the Murrayite thesis, Margaret Murray wrote a book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, published in the early 20s, became widely read amongst the reading general public of England and the UK. And that book stated that the witches' sabbats that are portrayed so vividly in witch trial transcripts, and the witches' sabbats which are portrayed so vividly in woodcuts and artistic drawings, as something terrible. Um, she looked at those, and her book, the thesis of her book, is that, oh, actually, we're looking at primitive primal tribal dances. We're looking at the worship of a horned primal tribal deity, and this is a pagan religion that survived underground into the Christian era, and the persecution of witches was the suppression of the last vestiges of this primal religion. And it made sense, visually and culturally and logically, I say in inverted commas, because she's writing at a time that many people were working in the British Empire, in the British civil service, and in tea plantations, the world of plantations around the world. And many people living in England had familiarity with primal, or should we say, inverted commas, tribal religions, because they had been posted to Sri Lanka or Borneo or what's now Ghana or the Gold Coast or Palestine. And so they saw dancing in circles, they saw transpossession, they saw, fetish objects or people in masks, put on elevated and reverenced as an incarnation of ancestors. This looked like a familiar shape. They saw ecstatic dancing, and they could understand religion as being something like that. And it made sense to them when reading Margaret Murray's book that the folklore, the last bits of maypole dancing and Morris dancing and all that, were a very whitewashed version of an ancient pagan religion. And looking at those woodcuts of the so-called witches' sabbat, it looks not dissimilar to the kind of thing that you might see in northern Nigeria or in southern Borneo. And so it made sense. So the Murrayite thesis that in England in the 17th century, the persecution of so-called witches was the persecution of the last clinging on underground members of Britain's own version of tribal religion. So it wasn't bonkers to the cultural context. The problem was that Margaret Murray, scholars of the 17th century, even at that time, knew here's an Egyptologist who's gone to stay in Glastonbury for the summer because she's having a bit of a hard time. And this is her side project to get her over a little bit of a rough patch. And she and so that's, she wasn't in her own field of expertise. The experts knew that, but the British public didn't. And as Ronald Hutton pointed out, the Murrayite thesis, Margaret Murray's thesis, that position remained in the Encyclopedia Britannica right up until I think the 1970s. So everybody was very excited when they got to tear it down. The UK pagan public started in the early 1980s. A few pagans who had university educations or were avid readers started picking it apart. And it was a gleeful process for them, and gleeful process for the scholars who'd from the academy had said, see, we told you so. See, it's ridiculous. And when people find somebody who's revered being wrong, there is a certain amount of joyful "I told you so, you silly woman." Um, and I think the glee has finally subsided. There was I think a one-day conference last year of appreciation for Margaret Murray. Not that she was right, but that she was important. She was sincere and she was important. She was, she was the one who was part of that whole landscape that made a group of friends, maybe more than one group of friends, but one group of friends that we know about in the village of Highcliffe or Southampton, somewhere around there, to say, let's try some tribal dancing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll use a really rollicking old ballad for the moon, like Tom of Bedlam, and let's do some wild calls as we run through the woods. And let's do some skinny dipping under the moon and raise our hands to her. And maybe we'll say an old charm that our grandmother knew, or maybe we'll just make something up. But Margaret Murray was part of those people that said, people used to do it here.
Yeah.
Then it's a short step to say, that just made that step of actually taking your clothes off, going out with some friends for some skinny dipping, made that a short step.
The thing that I kind of, and the reason I kind of wanted to ask you about Margaret Murray, kind of for her placement in the introduction to the book, is a lot of the criticism of her book is that, well, she's describing this kind of like a golden chain, and often a hyperbolic critique is that she's describing something that has maintained in the same state since antiquity, and like that's obviously not the case. But the bit that I find particularly beautiful, and I found it kind of fairly amplified in your book, is that her work helps, as you've really described already, formulate those threads. It actually reignites the flame,
Yeah. One of my aims in the book was to dismantle the idea that it was only Margaret Murray's book that made the witchcraft revival happen. The igniting of modern pagan witchcraft in the 30s. That it wasn't reading one book. It wasn't reading her one book. It was everything that was around them.
Yeah.
And in fact, an anthology's worth. And my reading tabs are sufficient enough that I could do a whole nother volume, a second volume of an anthology. People might get very, very tired of that, but I love reading poetry and short extracts. So, I'd like it, but I'm not going to subject Black Letter Press to that. But she was just a drop in the ocean of things that made people want to make a ritual with a priestess, for the force of life, or Pan, or Orange God of Death.
So in terms of kind of the various different themes that provided the platform for this revival, as you said, there was many kind of interlocking cultural artifacts that kind of made this all possible. Where would you like to go next in those artifacts?
I think that the thing that I find most moving is to think of the village of Highcliffe, which is now in Hampshire, down on the south coast of England. It's very provincial, it's very white, but a lot of Bohemians moved there in the 20s. Southampton was an outpost for Bohemians. There are people doing yoga, people doing some theosophy, people doing some co-masonry, bit of Rudolf Steiner, and of course, people doing seances and table tapping and table turning, and bit of past life regression. Everybody's learning about reincarnation, and it is against these 7 or 8 people. We have some of their names. We don't have a smoking gun, but researcher Philip Heselton has got us about a list of 8 or 10 names of people who I am convinced, as an bluntly an Oxford trained medieval scholar, used to working with fragments, I am convinced they are the thing. And I'm looking for the smoking gun. I'm spending too much time in archives. So we got Rosamond, we've got Catherine, we've got Edith, and we got Ernie, and we've got Dion, and whose real name was Harry, and we've got these folks there, and they're trying stuff out. And the question that I asked myself is why? What drove these people? What were the drivers of this thing? They started calling themselves witches before 1935. We know that. Possibly around 1930, they start viewing themselves as people who were met in this lifetime, who had been witches in a previous lifetime, and they were meant to meet again in this lifetime as friends to bring this back, to bring back pagan mystery cult religion. And they do it by trial and error. And I thought, why would you try so hard? Because they were at it for 15 years. They were close friends, but they made up an oath of secrecy and loyalty. They bolstered up the ritual structures, and they would go out, they'd go out into the woods sometimes under the full moon and just howl and shriek and be free. And almost like, men and women maenads. Why would you do that? It was just it was a bit like some of the stuff happening, but it was a bit more edgy, And then I think, you said, where do I want to go with this? And where I want to go with this is to think about what they were looking around and seeing. And I mentioned, going to a cold stone parish church in the middle of a Hampshire village every Sunday to be told, you're sinners. One of them was a single mother, divorced. So of course she couldn't be invited to the nice tea parties in that era. To be a divorced single mother, you're outside. You are just outside. That's that. Any teenage girl in the village or the town or even London who got pregnant, her life is ruined. People can't live together outside of marriage, and this is all just straight world. Men are presumed that, men are measured on what salary they bring home for their wife. People feel sorry and marginalize the couple who's barren, that can't have children. God forbid, don't want children. And, so a man who doesn't have a legacy or a lineage with children is a little bit, a bit pathetic. A man who has low salary is a bit pathetic. A man who would rather be a musician or a poet or a photographer is pathetic. What he really ought to do is go down to the accountancy office in that suit and just toe the line. And this group of Bohemians did not like that. And what they saw was the C of E of that time, right? I've got friends in the C of E. I sit on interfaith councils, all of that stuff. But they saw the C of E at that time. And having lived in Africa and Asia, or having relatives who did and visited, they just thought, this is not okay. This is not okay. Where's, where is Pan? Where, can't a man have his cloven hooves? Can't a woman drop her clothes and raise her hands to the moon and be reverenced as a priestess in authority? So it was very future. So they built this thing to make a better future, a freer future. And I think what drove them, what inspired, and I think what strengthened them was a lot of the writing and the poetry, that some of which, a sampling of which I've tried to put in a book, but it wasn't po-faced like some of those really self-improvement movements of the 20s. It didn't have the, I would say, the sanctimonious quality, but it didn't have, it was a bit more frisky and frolicky and rebellious than the yoga people or the theosophy people or the, some of these other, very, very worthy movements. They were like, they were having, sexy times as well as, running around times, as well as serious times. And so I like I think the countercultural side of it is very, very important. And that's really precious to me. You know, it's really, really precious to me.
But yeah, that's so interesting. And in terms of kind of like the anthology that you've pulled together here, and you've built this kind of mosaic to support these threads, from the literature, from the wide range of research. Is this stuff that you believe these people had access to or actively engaging with? I know some of it's later than the period, but
some of it's, yeah. My latest book is 1941, and it was so good I couldn't resist it. We don't know exactly most of what they read. However, we do have notebooks of one of them, a later member. So we have his notebooks of poems he copied out and ballads he copied out, and we have a couple books, 3 or 4 books, of which we have the ownership signatures of a couple of the women in that group. So we know they own that. And one of them, a late arrival, he was an avid reader, and he was well off enough to collect books. We have most of his library, so we can look out the books that he owned, and minus the ones that he lent out and didn't get back. But some of the so we do know some of them. What's in the notebooks and copied out, we know that that at least some of them had. Yeah, I say very carefully that in the anthology, this isn't an anthology of things that we know that they read. It's an anthology of things that were around that a lot of people.
And you mentioned that that there was potential sexy time, and I know that I was literally looking at one of the quotes from the 1941 book as we speak. The George Willie's called phallic worship. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Putting it in the context, I know there was supposed to be the Roaring Twenties, but certainly the kind of overall Christian view wasn't great when it came to say human sexuality. But when we talk about kind of a ritualistic expression of sexuality, what do you think that looked like?
I'll preface that by saying one of the things that struck me about the Roaring Twenties and the reclamation of sexuality was also a time of crisis for the C of E. People were less and less happy with it on a larger scale that really bothered the church, and they were very concerned. A lot of first time big serious questioning about major themes of the social rules of the C of E for people in England and the UK and Ireland, of course, is Catholic, so I'm going to that. But that was very secular. So this thing happened that being religious meant being sterile. It meant being chaste, meant being celibate. And a little bit of that feeling is there, a tiny bit of that in the yoga movement. It's certainly there in the theosophy movement. There's being spiritual, and that means not having strong passions. It's also there in the Buddhism that comes over at the time. And being sexy was being in London, being a flapper, listening to jazz, and it's very secular. So sex is secular, and chastity is religious. And these guys want to just shake that up. They don't, nonsense to that. Look at Pan. Look at Aphrodite. And I'm mentioning all these Greek ones because these people, even if they weren't classically educated, those were the children's stories that English people read from lower middle class and up. So we all knew that Pan is everywhere. Pan's being carved. He's on tchotchkes. He's on, he's everywhere. There's poems everywhere. Everything is about Pan at that time in the Edwardian era. So these guys are really grabbing onto that and saying, you know what? Sex can be religious. Religiosity is ecstasy of the body. Ecstasy of the body gives you altered states in which you can achieve union with the divine. And, one of the quote that got imported into early witchcraft was a borrowing from Crowley, and it was a borrow. It says, "There's no part of us that is not of the gods." That yeah, you know, sex can be sacred, but it doesn't have to be in an uncomfortable yoga position with one person that you've been prepared for 28 years. It could just be really, really some rumpy pumpy with somebody you just met because the moment took you. That is like Pan's panic, and that is part of the sacred as well. And you know, I have to hand it to them for that. You know, we got like, you know, there's Catherine and Ernie and the other Catherine and Edith and you know, little Gerald, who's the late comer, and Rosamond, and they're just, I think it's incredible. It's a group of friends. It's a group of friends thing. So I like the way in which they revalorize sex. You know, bringing it back to the spiritual, reclaiming it for religiosity, but in a way that allowed for the twinkle in the eye.
That's really interesting, and I can't help but look at it through the prism of growing up a Catholic in Ireland. You know, where that what you've described as only happened in kind of the last 20, 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, pre-famine Celtic Christianity, the Christianity of the people, Catholicism of the people rather, was not puritanical at all. You know, and indeed, one of the famous sites in Ireland, Croagh Patrick, where there is the kind of the annual pilgrimage and the church on the top. Now, couples used to go. Couples used to visit that site when the sun rose. I think it was when the sun rose. Then I can't remember it correctly, but to have sex at the bottom of it, right? To try and conceive. You know, like the direct antithesis of what it is now. Now people, well, kind of stopped it. Now people used to crawl up it on their hands and knees in penance, you know, or walk barefoot in penance.
Yeah.
You know, so it's interesting how we see these kind of ideas. But the opposite was happening in Ireland while this was happening in the UK. I can only imagine how exciting it must have been at the time, how revolutionary.
It's such a departure. I think, you know, yeah, it's just how, you know, they weren't completely different from the other Bohemians around them, but they. You know, the closest that we find is something called the Kibbo-Kift, or the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry, which were these, you know, back to nature movements that were quite pagan, that were up the road elsewhere in the New Forest going on. Not exactly at the same time, but I think there's an overlap of time. And, you know, it looks very, very similar. You know, it looks very, very similar. Like, you know, yes, they're doing, you know, rituals in nature. It's a bit like pagan Boy Scouts, and they have boys and girls together, and they're doing some ceremonies outdoors to the sun, but they've got like banners. It's a little bit more druidy. And I thought, well, this looks quite like it. And then I push a bit further and I dig a bit deeper, and it's like, oh yes, central conclave is all men. Women basically knit, embroider, and serve and stand in the back row. Yes, you know, and you had to be sexually abstinent when you were there, because, you know, because of standards. And I'm like, okay, so I'm very focused on the sun as light, and the sun in Western society, going back 2,000 years, is coded as male. It just is, right? We've coded the sun as male. We code the moon as female. And they're very sun-oriented. Now, you know, the sun is not inherently male, but they're part of that coding. You know, these woodcraft chivalry and Kibbo-Kift up the road. I mean, you know, we got the witches down the road going like nighttime, and yeah, we've got a horned god. You know, we have male divinity, but guess what? He's got horns. He's got antlers. He's got cloven hoofs. He's up for it. it's really lovely. Gerald Gardner writes in his 1953 book, I think it's 53. He says, that the desire that we find in the goddess that we worship is vibrant, intense, immediate, and urgent. So there's this lunar quality to it, which is very transcendent, if you will, but dark, of the night. But her eroticism has agency. She has desire. She's not just desired; she desires, and that's why it's written. He says the early witches. Gerald Gardner was the one who was white enough, rich enough, and retired enough without children enough to be the only one who was able to be out. He writes and he says, yeah, the witches, I don't really understand a lot of their theology. It's very broad brushstrokes. They barely understand it. Yeah, their goddess, they worship a goddess, and she seems to be like the force of life, and she's sort of lunar. She is quite lunar. Yes, she is definitely lunar, but she's also like Aphrodite. She's also Venusian, and that is the active desire, is that they loved, at least one or two of them absolutely loved prose poetry. Loving somebody's poetry and dropping some of it into some of your rituals does not mean that man made your religion. Because they dropped in all sorts of poetry. But one of the pieces of Crowley poetry they dropped in was that part of the speech from the Gnostic Mass, in which Thelemites will know well, where the priestess sits upon the altar and she says, I yearn to you, I desire you. Come to me, veiled or voluptuous, pale or purple. I yearn for you. And those who were in that witch coven, they see Crowley poetry and like, yes. So they did have sexy times. They definitely, they have sexy times in a way that I think was so powerful and exciting and transgressive for them in a way we can't even dream of. We can't even imagine what it must have been like to have a free space in private to just experiment. A non-judgmental space. And that's the oaths of secrecy were quite important because it had to be, a space where you could feel free. And the women took the lead. I mean, I was a young woman who knew a lot of old people. And I was in my early to mid 20s. I stumbled across these old witches from the 50s who were then in their 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, they just said, yeah, for us, having a place that we could be erotic and feel free and not judged was so, we're even talking about this in the 50s. They just said, you don't understand what it was for us. So, yeah, they, like, I don't think we need to do that. I think for us, the transgression would be like having, leaving your phone at home. I think that's our equivalent today.
That's so true. That's so true. Do you know? Oh, I'm laughing because you've just reminded me of being quite pathetic, where I kind of left my phone in the car, or to go off to go for a walk on the beach. I was really proud of myself. It's so sad.
Yeah.
What it's done to us.
I was like, it's really funny because when people say, "Oh my God, there they were in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s," and they do their rituals, and then they'd have a bit of a swinger session, but a bit of whatever, a bit of dancing, bit of disco music, a bit of private time, a bit of snogging with who they fancied in the group. And what I will say, that the feminist drive of that movement meant that the initiative of the woman was always respected and very important. So, this isn't a scenario in which in this group of friends down the decades, the friends joined, old friends, moved away. But it was one in which the woman's word, the woman's initiative, to go in the corner and have a snog, that was part of that commitment to it says bringing back the goddess, bringing back the autonomy of women and letting women reclaim their erotic desire. was really important. And I was like, well, what do we have now? What is so transgressive that we need a time apart that we know can't be infringed upon? And I think it's like, I really do think it's leaving the phone out. That's ours. Where I can't check, I can't be checked on. You know, I think what what sexual shame was the 20s is, work responsibility and accountability on a 60-second basis. That's what enslaves us, plus all the rest.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And a question I kind of wanted to ask you as well was about Pan, and kind of what your thoughts were on kind of the women's relationship with Pan.
Well, he's probably a bit more exciting for their fantasies than, downtrodden, exhausted husband in a suit. Getting off the commuter train at Surbiton with his briefcase. And I think that's attractive for a reason, because he's a symbol of a man who's not been downtrodden, molded, and shaped entirely to the removal of his identity by society. That's very sexy for women, but I hope it's also attractive to men. Something's really, really badly wrong when we measure men in that basis and show no feeling, be it joy, be it randiness, be it tears. We say, what has patriarchal monotheism given us? Well, it removed priestesses, it removed goddesses, it removed polytheism, it removed body positivity, it removed sex positivity. I'm not saying that all pagan religions are panaceas, but this was how they saw it. But it also gave, I'll go out on a limb here and say I think that it is that legacy that gave us the statistic of the major killer of men under age 45 in this country is suicide.
Indeed, yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah,
it's simply brutal.
So people say, oh, Wicca, it's very feminist. I mean, not people, but there is a way of seeing the return of the goddess and the return of autonomous priestesses as somehow marginalizing men. But these people didn't see it this way. They saw it as exciting for everybody and better for it, because it also brought back the cloven hoofs and the dancing and the singing and the being brothers and sisters together, right? Which wasn't such a big thing until then. There was men's culture and women's culture.
Yeah, and when you talk about, I like that, bring it back to cloven hooves. I like that as an expression. Well, when you think about it in terms of like, one of the basic tenets of your of Christianity is to emulate, the deities in their behavior. So, well, I say deities in terms of the Holy Trinity. He's monotheist. Don't have it.
Marvelous.
Yeah, but what you have is like a celibate God and a virgin mother, and that's that's what you're supposed to look at, and then you compare that to Pan, in all its phallic glory.
Yeah. The body positivity of these people was really something, and was right out there in front. We refuse to be ashamed. We refuse to be ashamed of desire. We refuse to be ashamed of living out of wedlock. We refuse to be ashamed of sex creating life. It's sometimes called, Wicca is sometimes called a fertility religion, and it more than 50% are happily childless, including the first generation in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So it's not a you should have babies fertility religion. It's a we're going to acknowledge that life is made by sweat and grunting and cries and ejaculations and fluids, and it's made by something that is very, very physical and very primal and very noisy, and it's not it's not a whisper from the transcendent into the virgin's ear that makes life. So it's fertility religion from the beginning amongst the childless and those who prefer other types of sex, to say, no, let's get real. That's how life is made. It's with the body, with sex. And we're not going to be ashamed of it.
Yeah.
Get real. It's kind of a get real thing.
I like that. And in a section of the book, you talk about kind of the reworking of ritual, and devising that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. From what we know, this is fragmentary construction, as medievalists, particularly early medievalists, know how to do. So what we see is a group of friends experimenting, and they're doing a lot of, initially it seems they're doing a lot of past life regression and scrying, and to try to understand how to build it up. Right? So they're doing some folklore research, but they're also doing a lot of trying to get guidance from the spirits, and the old gods. How are we going to do this? What should it look like? What should it feel like? How formal should it be? When are we going to celebrate nature? What should we do under the moon? It coalesces into more and more structure down the decades. When we know 1939, they have some kind of admission ceremony that's called an initiation, and there is an oath of secrecy and loyalty to say, so when this guy joins in 1939, he says, he writes about it afterwards. He said, I would not break my oath to my friends because the oaths are sacred, and I wouldn't betray my friends. And then he said, the night of my initiation was the happiest night of my life. He said, even before he joined the circle of friends first. He said, even before I joined, it took me through this ceremony, I would have gone through hell and high water, even then, for any of them. So the friendship aspect is really important. And the ritual is a way of coalescing and formalizing the activities of the friendship. Something we kind of forget about, and maybe because we're used to ceremonial orders or Catholic Church, we think of ritual as being the most important thing in terms of religious practice. In fact, the underscore layer of these people is the circle of friends. And what you do with that circle of friends in terms of ecstatic experiences, trance, states of union with divinity, embodied eroticism and wildness, whatever is going to get you free, you're going to put some ritual around that to hold it. It's framing ritual, but it has to build on that circle of trust that's in friendship. It's meaningless without that. So they build this up, they borrow a bit when they're coalescing, and they slightly formalize. Seems they get more, the initiation ritual gets a little bit more formalized to give their new incoming friend a better experience, right? So they borrow a bit from some Crowley, a couple of them are co-masons, they add a little bits from that, but, and they, they tweak it a little bit down the decades to make it work better, to give a better experience, yeah? And that's one kind of ritual building up, and the other is the framework for the ecstatic experience, or the poetry that they're going to, or the trances they're going to go into, or the dances they're going to do, and that is the opening and closing of the witch's circle. And the words for that are borrowed, I think, from the grimoire tradition a little bit. Making the space, going between the worlds, changing dimensions. They borrow words. They love poetry, but they weren't writers themselves for the most part. So we'll have that. That makes sense. you'll say a little something as you make the salt water to cleanse the space. Oh yeah, I think there's something in the Key of Solomon. Yeah, we'll have that. It's just something to say while you're doing the action. Text and words are never as important as action, and action is never as important as feeling. Sorry, I will get out of the pulpit now.
Oh no, go for it. Go for it.
I say that because people get very, very excited about text, and I think if you find the sources of the text, that you understand the components that built up the religion or the movement. Oh yes, Wicca was made up, really, really constructed by Crowley, because there's so much, fragments of Crowley here and there, and there's a little bit from the Key of Solomon here. So it's a mishmash of Key of Solomon and Freemasonry and Crowley. And I would say, no, it's friendship, it's energy, it's ecstatic, and it's making a safe space. And you got to have a little bit of poetry and structure. And that comes last, and that can actually be dispensed with, and you still have the whole thing there.
Cool. Well, we're pushing on.
Yeah.
But if people want to find out more about you, your work, Treadwell's, where's the best place for them to do so?
Gosh, the best place to find me, and I'm always welcome to email me. I'm quite a sociable person. Is through the Treadwell's website. We're a small staff. Just everything will come to me. If it says Dear Christine, it'll come to me. We're only like 4 in the shop. So, and Dreams of Witches is available. This is what the hardback looks like. This is the second edition.
You're a bit blurry there.
There it is. Oh, it's blurring out. Sorry about that. It's very nice. And there's also a paperback, which is also, a mercy for most of us that they did a paperback. And yeah, Treadwell's is open 7 days a week. We're in our 21st year. They're just north of the British Museum, short hop, skip and a jump from Tottenham Court Road Tube Station. And, it's a friendly place. And we decided, when I first opened it, that it was going to be a friendly place. It was going to be open 7 days a week. And we've stuck to that. We've stuck to that. And I'm just, looking, at the moment, I'm finishing another book. So, but I will speak not of such things until they're done.
Yes, fair enough.
It's a whole thing. But it's what's really, really nice is you're able to come talk about creativity and ritual and magic with you there. That's the best part of my day.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you back on the show, and great to catch up. And congratulations on a very, very beautiful book. On retrieving this book, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Super. Good cut.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christina. A wonderful conversation. I'm sure you'll all agree. And if you want to find out more about Christina's work, or indeed get yourself a copy of Dreams of Witches, then do check the links below. That's it from me. I'm Darren Mason, and you may listen to Spirit Box. Take care and talk soon. Bye.